Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And we are back with another installment of Behind the Shots. So this has been very popular for us, and it keeps getting requested, so we're going to keep doing it. So today we are going over 3 more of Alex's images that I have picked, and he's going to talk us through them. So the first one that comes up.
Right, the first one is this one, which is a coral spawning picture taken in the Cayman Islands. And this picture is one that it means a lot to me, and is one I would have picked probably if I'd been picking them. And really because it's a picture that, I put so much into to get this shot. Back in the early 2000s, no one had ever seen mass coral spawning in the Cayman Islands. And a friend of mine who ran a dive center there he'd had, I think, one of the universities in Florida down trying to see it, and they'd not managed to find it. And he sort of was chatting to me about it, saying, you haven't got any insight into when it would happen. And I went away and just went through all the literature and had a really good think about it and came back with these predictions for when it would happen. And he was like, "Oh, you must come out for it." And I, so I went out that first year for it, and the timings were right to within 2 or 3 minutes. And those same predictions have been right every single year since, based on obviously the changing lunar cycle. And so I was able to photograph, to be the first person to photograph coral spawning in the Cayman Islands. And then 10 years after those original predictions, which is 20 years ago now, but the original predictions were 20 years ago, or the first year we saw it, I think, was 2003 or 4, I can't remember. It must have been 2003, actually. But yeah, in 2013, I went back for the 10-year anniversary of us first seeing it, and wanted to create some really interesting images for it. And I wasn't running a workshop week, I just went on my own to go and see it. And so wanted to create really different images. And so had the idea to do a backlit shot of the coral spawning. And because of the studying I'd done, I knew which corals would spawn on which nights. So I set my remote strobe up and basically waited for the coral to spawn. And you have to kind of wait in the darkness, because if you sit there with the torch on the coral, it's not going to spawn. So I just waited in the darkness for this one to spawn. And then when it spawned, did these backlit shots of the coral, found the right coral that I could hide my strobe behind, waited for it to spawn and photographed this shot. So it always means a lot to me because of that. I shot it with the Nikon D4, which was my camera at the time. I was shooting with a Nauticam housing. And I shot it with the 15mm fisheye on a 1.4 teleconverter with a relatively, I think with the 140 dome. I remember using quite a small dome because I was worried about scratching a big dome diving at night in the dark, and especially because the camera didn't have any lights on it, because it was wanting to keep everything nice and dark most of the time. I used the teleconverter really because I wanted a wide angle lens that would work well with the small dome, which the fisheye would. And also I didn't want too wide a field of view. So it was the Sigma 15 on the 1.4 teleconverter. And then this was shot just with the fast shutter speed, as you can see. I shut the aperture down because with that smaller dome, you didn't always get the best corners unless you were pretty well shut down. And that's what gave the settings. But yeah, it's always been a really, sort of memorable shot for me for that combination of what went into it. And this particular shot was awarded in the GDT European Wildlife Photographer of the Year, which was, a nice reward for the, for getting those shots.
How did you get the strobe to fire? Because you said there was no lighting on the housing.
So there was strobe on the housing, but I didn't have a torch on the housing because it was about, you want to be dark on these dives really a lot of the time. So I had single strobe. I had 2 strobes on the housing, but I think I only had one on for this shot because I wanted it predominantly backlit with just a bit of light coming through from the front. And I did a number of shots of this, and you only have 20 seconds to do all these shots because that's how long the coral's spawning for. So, you do the first shot, and then I was literally just turning the flash up by a click, doing another shot, flash up by a click. So I have a series of shots from basically a full silhouette of the coral all the way through to kind of a fully lit version of the coral.
Yeah, I like being able to see a little bit of the detail on the coral head itself. Then you get to know I know what it is anyway, but it gives some context as to what is actually creating the whole egg masses and things like that. And I didn't realize though that, well, foolishly I suppose, I didn't realize that if you had a torchlight on them, they wouldn't spawn. And I didn't realize that
they will eventually, I think, but you can knock them really out of sync with their neighbors, you know, because
yeah. I also didn't realize it happened that quick. I assumed it would be, 2 or 3 minutes, not 20 or 30 seconds.
Very variable about the species. So most of them have this kind of gamete bundle setting stage where you actually see the gametes starting to protrude from the polyps, and you're like, okay, there's going to be some action soon. And the mistake is at that point then to sit there with a torch on the coral waiting for it to spawn. They have quite a synchronized release that kind of goes almost like a blush spreading across the coral. And the gametes don't float up initially. So you have about 20 seconds from when the gametes kind of start being released across the coral till they actually start floating up. And I would say this shot is probably taken about 60 seconds after the gametes were released, when they're all up into the water column above. But once they're up and above, they're on their way out of the shot. So you have only then just a few seconds to get the shots. And so it was quite a disciplined shoot of knowing what I wanted, accepting that I was going to get to shoot this coral, and then maybe when I finished, quickly rush over to another coral that hadn't spawned, set it up, and do the shots again. And I was diving with 2 cameras on I remember on these dives. So I'd had a macro camera that I was kind of going around doing macro shots of the spawning, and then switching over to the wide angle for these shots. So it's always been a favourite shot of mine, this one. So thanks for choosing it. Absolutely. Right, I'll move us on to the next one, which is a very happy looking hawksbill turtle, which was munching on soft corals this is at Ras Mohammed in Egypt. And I like this picture just because it's a very joyful, fun picture. Shot with the Nikon D850 and the 8-15mm fisheye, the 230mm dome, shot on f/14, 100th of a second, and then ISO 250. So just it's kind of, it was 1 year running Red Sea workshops. There were lots of hawksbills at Ras Mohammed eating the soft corals there. And I'd say every dive we went in, we'd have 1 or 2 of them. And they were really feeding on the red soft corals. So although there were schools of fish and other things to shoot on the dives, the fact that these guys were really munching on the soft corals was great to shoot. Looking at the light on this, it looks like an afternoon dive because the sun is sort of stuck behind the reef. So the free face is in shade in this. And this is obviously the front for me, it's the front of Ras Mohammed and Shark Reef there. And I just love the expression of the turtle with his mouth open, his arms outstretched. And this shot, it was really memorable. I have to say, from those encounters on that trip, I must have 20 or 30 shots of turtles eating soft corals that I absolutely love. And probably have more from that trip than the rest of my life put together. Because, when it all comes together and you just have a super friendly turtle that was just constantly eating bright red soft corals, you can get a lot of pictures very quickly. And I've got quite a range of different shots, but this one's always been a favourite. And I think I probably need a little bit of brushwork in the processing to highlight that red soft coral in its mouth. I think the original shot, there wasn't that much strobe in there, but it was just brightened up inside the mouth, just to bring that right, because there is a great big piece of soft coral in there. So just brightened up. So I really like this picture. It's like the previous one. It gets published a lot. Because I think it's quite a joyful, inviting underwater picture. It's not really a contest shot. I think it's a bit simplistic for that, but it's a very popular shot for magazine use.
I like it especially because I struggle to photograph turtles. I don't see a lot diving, so I usually only see them free diving, and I'm not the world's greatest free diver, so limited time. And the spots that are well known in Florida for them on free dive are not the most aesthetically pleasing. So there's kind of on barren, algae-covered rocks. So at some point, I'm going to get a good turtle picture, but I admire good turtle pictures especially because I can't get any and don't have any. But I'll change that eventually.
And the Red Sea is a fantastic. It's not like an amazing place for turtles, but there are always turtles around there. Ras Mohammed is good for them. The Strait of Tiran is good for them as well if you're a regular visitor to that part of the world. But they do really like eating the red soft corals there. Whereas in Asia, they will eat the soft corals, but they often prefer eating zoanthids and coral polyps and things like that. They have they're not always, and corallimorphs and that sort of thing, which aren't anywhere near as pretty as the red soft corals. The hawksbills in the Caribbean tend to eat sponges more than soft corals, and those can be colourful again. But you often find them eating brown sponges and things like that. So it's when you get in the Red Sea, the combination of the turtles that are used to divers and that they eat happily such colourful food, it does make for really nice photography opportunity. But yeah, I think this particular individual, I probably have at least 5 or 6 very well-known shots, all of which are very different pictures, all of which feature the same turtle. Because I, just spent time with this turtle over a dive or two, taking very different types of shots, rather than going, this is the shot I want, I'm going to take the best possible version of this shot, which I was trying to do. But I was also very keen to know that I wanted more than just one shot, because I realized this was a great opportunity to have a variety of pictures. So a very different shot of this turtle is on the cover of my friend Professor Callum Roberts' memoir called Reef Life. And it's the same turtle, but you wouldn't know it's the same turtle because the shot is so different.
All right, on to the next one.
Right, the final one of the 3. This one's taken about 20 meters away from the previous shot, but a good 15 years earlier. So this is a Bohar snapper at Ras Mohammed in the Red Sea, taken as the school is moving. So the school isn't all clumped up at this point. The school has decided to move from one place to another, and I happened just to get in their way, and they're all just swimming past me when I took this picture. The school of Bohar snappers has remained present as a summer gathering in the Red Sea at Ras Mohammed, but not as big as it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. It got hit by quite a bit of fishing pressure. These are very long-lived fish. They can live 75 years easy. And so it takes a while for the population to build back up. So they've been reasonably well protected over the last 5-10 years, but the numbers are taking a while to get up to those really big numbers that we used to have in the old days. And I think the more fish there were, the more confident they were. So some of the shots that I took in the early 2000s, when I was one of the only people there shooting them on digital, I think still stand the test of time as images, just because people haven't had the same opportunities since, because when the school is maybe 60% of the size, the fish are just a little bit less sure of themselves. And I certainly remember in those early days, you really could just be in the school and the school accepted you as like another person. Whereas now they just give you that little bit of distance. So we still get lovely shots of them, and you always hope to get a really big gathering, because I do think when they get a really big group together, you get the great opportunities. Anyway, this shot was actually inspired by a friend of mine in the early days of digital. And what was really interesting was that I had a friend who was not an underwater photographer, and he went to the Red Sea with a really basic compact camera at the time. It was probably only 1 or 2 megapixels, and I'm not exaggerating, I mean, that's what they were in those days. And he came back with a really lovely set of underwater pictures from the Red Sea. Not artistically beautiful, but they all had come out and they all looked really good. And I was just really amazed by that, because I was like, I was a member of the British Society of Underwater Photographers, and I was thinking, this guy with the compact who knows nothing about underwater pictures has produced a set of pictures that probably half the members of my society wouldn't be able to get with their fancy SLR cameras. And it was basically because the compact camera was allowing him to bend the rules of underwater photography. We didn't have, on film, you didn't have adjustable white balance. If you didn't get the right amount of strobe on your subject was blue. Or overexposed, whereas him with his adjustable white balance compact was getting these shots, and with a bit of processing and the camera doing a bit of processing, his shots were all coming out. And it got me thinking that you could bend the rules of underwater photography, and what I realized is I could try taking pictures from further away than I'd ever dare to do on film, because if I'd shot this picture on film, it would just be completely blue. But I realized that if I, chose to shoot a picture from further away underwater and used a bit of processing and used the fact that a digital camera had adjustable white balance, I could end up, creating a really interesting, different picture. So this picture here was shot with a technique which I later called telephoto underwater, which was using a long lens on a camera, and I pushed my strobes way out in front of my camera to cut down the light path to the subject, and I was basically shooting, quite big sub scenes with a telephoto lens underwater, and then adding contrast in post and white balancing. And these were the days where you couldn't white balance like endlessly. It was before Lightroom. You didn't have sliders or a dropper to white balance. You could just choose one of the preset white balances of the camera. So I had to take a test shot and preset the white balance by shooting a rock on the reef, just at the time, and then use that white balance to then be able to go and shoot the fish. So I had a stored white balance that I could use in processing. So just a vagary of the processing software of those times. You couldn't choose a white balance that you didn't have at the time of shooting, just because that's how basic the software was. And the result was that by taking a type of picture that I knew I wouldn't be able to take on film, because it would just come out wrong, but knowing that I would be able to get away with it on digital, it encouraged me from seeing this new guy's shots that I should, basically try and bend the rules, expand the envelope of what we were able to do. And none of that is why this picture works. This picture works because this fish is a great portrait. It really connects with the viewer. The background really tells a fantastic story. And the eye contact and the emotion that this particular angle on the fish has gives, it looks like an angry fish.
Yeah.
People love that. Fish obviously isn't angry. But I think the perspective created such an original underwater image, and this was a category winner in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, winning the portrait category, which is the largest category, and must have been very, very close to being the overall winner. Which I think, if that had happened for me in 2004, I don't think I would have handled it particularly well and wouldn't have made the most of it, because I was, basically, it was my first year of being a pro underwater photographer. I wasn't in 2005. It was, sorry. I took the shot in 2004, but I didn't enter it in that year's competition because it was the first year they were allowing digital. And I was like, I'm not going to enter any digital shots because I think the competition would be very biased against digital at that time, just so I didn't risk it. But actually, in the end, Doug Perrine won that year with a digital shot. And I was like, okay, right, the next year I'm going to put all my digital shots in because I just entered my slides because the judging was so based around slides. Anyway, this ended up as a category winner. And in fact, whenever the Wildlife Photographer does a retrospective on this year of the 2005 competition, it's always my shot they show. They never show the overall winner. So I think historically it's always been considered to be the most memorable shot from that year. And I don't think that any of that background is why the judges were appealed to them. I think it's simply that they recognized there was something about this shot that had something they hadn't seen before in an underwater picture. And that came very much from me deliberately trying to do things differently from what other underwater photographers could do at the time, because almost nobody was shooting digital back then. I mean, lots of people retrospectively now say, oh, yeah, I was doing it in the early 2000s. But, I can assure you that there weren't so many. And, I was still getting lots of grief from the film photographers because there was quite a lot of antagonism towards digital. And people would, come onto the forums at Wet Pixel and slag us all off and, say, oh, your pictures are worthless. They never got to have, in 5 years' time, no one's going to want to see all these digital pictures. They're going to want to see the film shots, and film is still way better than digital. And the irony is I can go back to this shot now and I've reprocessed it at super resolution, and it was shot on a 6 megapixel camera, but up-resed, it looks amazing. You can make it into a 50 megapixel file. The lens is sharp, the picture's sharp. It looks great.
Yeah. So just for some perspective, in 2004, I was shooting a throwaway Kodak picture or camera that my parents had given me for our second ever dive trip. And I was 11, and I was just happy to get any fish all the way in the frame. I can still remember I have a blue tang. It's facing the wrong way.
But it's in there.
But it's in the frame, and I was so happy with that picture. So it's times have sure changed, but I've always loved this picture, irrespective of all the awards it's been given, because like you said, the look on the fish's face, it looks intimidating. It looks angry. And of course, we're anthropomorphizing a fish which doesn't have those emotions, but and then all of its henchmen in the background. It looks like it's holding its ground there, waiting for all of its buddies to get closer. And
yeah, no, it's I try not to overshow it these days, so I often don't include it when I'm doing slideshows of my work, just because I think it's more fun to show the new stuff. And but yeah, it still has a fantastic appeal on audiences. The one thing I wanted to say about this actually is that I've been to the Red Sea most of the 20 years since I took this picture, and I've attempted to take similar shots, and I've never once got anything that is close to measuring up to this. It's one of those things that everything aligned when I took this picture. I was very clearly after this shot, but I know how to do this technique. I've gone back in very specifically many times with macro lens on, intending to shoot portraits of these snappers, and I've never quite got the same connection with the subject, and I've certainly never got the same connection with the subject with such a great backdrop. So it is one of those shots that, despite knowing exactly how to do it, I wouldn't be going back and being able to repeat it.
And that's one of the best things about photography is, you capture this one moment in time, and no matter how hard you try, it doesn't mean it's ever going to be repeated, which is a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, and in most of those 20 years, I've taken groups of photographers back, and I can assure you on every workshop, there's at least 4 or 5 people who dedicate a dive to trying to get something close to this picture, and it's really difficult. It was just a lucky day. The fish wanted to come that close to me, and I was able to get the shot. So that seems like a pretty good place for us to wind up. So thanks everyone for watching the Underwater Photography Show. We'll be back again soon, but for now, goodbye.